Get out of here. I don't care who your parents think they are. You don't belong here." Those were the words that cut through the peaceful afternoon air in the upscale neighborhood of Willowbrook Heights, spoken by Patricia Coleman as she stood towering over 8-year-old Katrina Washington. The little girl's face was already streaked with tears. "I was just getting my ball back," Katrina sobbed, her voice trembling with confusion and fear. She couldn't understand how retrieving her basketball from where it had bounced could lead to this moment of terror. But Patricia wasn't finished. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed down at the child like a weapon as she spat out her next words. "Next time, ask permission before stepping on my property." The venom in her voice revealed this wasn't just about a ball or property lines. This was about something much deeper, much uglier. Patricia Coleman thought she had all the power in this situation. She thought she was dealing with people who would cower, apologize, and disappear. She thought her address in this exclusive neighborhood, her status, her assumptions about this little black girl and her family gave her the right to strike a child and speak to her with such hatred. She had no idea that everything she believed about power was about to be turned completely upside down. If you want to see how this story of justice and consequences unfolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. If you stand against prejudice and injustice, comment yes in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. You will definitely get a response from Living Stories. Because what Patricia didn't know as she stood there, drunk on her own perceived authority, was that a sleek black sedan was already on its way, and the person behind the wheel had just received a phone call that would change everything. Patricia Coleman was about to learn that the little girl she had just assaulted wasn't just any child, and her parents weren't just any parents. Let me take you back to the beginning of this day, when everything seemed normal, and show you exactly how Patricia's world was about to come crashing down. Earlier that morning, 8-year-old Katrina Washington had bounced excitedly in the back seat of her parents' car as they drove through the tree-lined streets of Willowbrook Heights. This wasn't just any visit to Grandma Rose's house. Katrina absolutely adored spending time with her 68-year-old grandmother, a retired teacher whose house was filled with the most amazing stories and the warmest hugs in the world. "Now remember, baby girl," her mother Diana had said, turning around from the passenger seat with that gentle but firm voice that made Katrina feel safe. "Grandma Rose has lived in this neighborhood for 2 years now, and she's worked hard to make it her home. You should be respectful to everyone, okay?" What Katrina didn't fully understand was just who her parents really were. To her, mommy was just mommy and daddy was just daddy. She knew they had important jobs that sometimes meant long meetings and serious phone calls, but at 8 years old, the weight of their positions hadn't quite sunk in. Diana Washington, her 36-year-old mother, wasn't just any working mom. She was the newly elected mayor of Willowbrook City, a former federal prosecutor who had built her career on fighting injustice and commanding respect in every courtroom she'd ever entered. And her father? 38-year-old Marcus Washington was the chief of police for the entire city, a 15-year veteran who had risen through the ranks not because of politics or connections, but because of pure merit and natural leadership. When Chief Washington walked into a room, people noticed. His presence was commanding, his tactical mind sharp, and his protective instincts when it came to his family were absolutely fierce. But none of that mattered to Katrina as she hugged her parents goodbye that morning. All she cared about was spending the afternoon shooting hoops in Grandma Rose's driveway while her parents attended what they called an important joint meeting about community safety. Little did anyone know that this meeting about keeping the community safe would be interrupted by a threat much closer to home. Grandma Rose Washington had become the heart of Elm Street since moving there 2 years ago. At 68, this retired teacher had used every penny of her savings and her teacher's pension to buy her dream house in Willowbrook Heights. She was proud of that house, proud of the life she'd built, and absolutely devoted to her granddaughter who visited whenever possible. Rose was known throughout the neighborhood for her wisdom, her kindness, and her ability to bring people together, qualities that would soon be put to the ultimate test. But there was someone else watching that morning. Someone whose view of the neighborhood was very different from Grandma Rose's welcoming perspective. Patricia Coleman, 42 years old and married to wealthy businessman Richard Coleman, had appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of what she called neighborhood standards. As the leader of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, Patricia ruled with an iron fist, believing that her family's old money and social status gave her authority over anyone she considered a new resident. Patricia wasn't just a stay-at-home wife. She was obsessed with maintaining what she saw as the proper social order. From her living room window, she watched the street like a hawk, cataloging who belonged and who didn't, who met her standards and who threatened them. And in her mind, certain people simply didn't belong in her neighborhood, no matter how hard they'd worked to get there. The stage was set for disaster when Katrina began playing basketball in her grandmother's driveway that afternoon. The rhythmic bounce of the ball on concrete, the squeak of her sneakers, the pure joy of a child at play. It should have been the most innocent sound in the world. Katrina was being careful, respectful, just as her parents had taught her. But when that orange basketball took one unfortunate bounce and rolled into Patricia's meticulously maintained garden, everything changed. Katrina approached Patricia's property line with the caution her mother had instilled in her. She could see her ball resting harmlessly among the perfectly arranged flowers. It hadn't damaged anything, hadn't even disturbed the mulch. Carefully, respectfully, she stepped just far enough onto the property to retrieve what was hers, being mindful not to harm a single petal. But Patricia Coleman had been watching from her living room window, and what she saw wasn't a polite child retrieving her ball. What she saw was confirmation of every prejudice, every assumption, every fear she'd harbored about the changing demographics of her precious neighborhood. If you're wondering how someone could harbor so much hatred toward a child, make sure you stay subscribed, because Patricia's true colors are about to be revealed in ways that will shock you. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever lived in a neighborhood where one person seemed to think they owned everything and everyone? How did you handle it? Drop your experiences in the comments below. Patricia Coleman was about to make the biggest mistake of her life, and she had no idea that the little girl she was targeting had parents who possessed more real power than Patricia could ever dream of. Patricia Coleman's front door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall behind it. She stormed out like a woman possessed, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight as her eyes locked onto little Katrina with the intensity of a predator spotting its prey. "What do you think you're doing in my garden?" Patricia's voice cut through the peaceful neighborhood air like a blade, sharp and cold and filled with an anger that seemed way too big for the situation at hand. Katrina, still crouched near the flower bed where she'd carefully retrieved her basketball, looked up with those wide, innocent eyes that only an 8-year-old can have. Her voice was small but polite, the way her parents and grandmother had taught her to speak to adults. "I'm sorry, ma'am. My ball rolled over here, and I was just getting it back. I didn't hurt any of your flowers, see?" She gestured gently toward the pristine garden, every petal still in place, every leaf undisturbed. But Patricia wasn't listening to explanations. She wasn't interested in evidence or logic or the obvious truth that this child had done absolutely nothing wrong. "I don't care," she spat, taking another step closer to Katrina, her shadow falling over the little girl like a dark cloud. "You have no right to be on my property." And that's when Patricia crossed the first line. She reached out and grabbed Katrina's small arm with her perfectly manicured fingers, gripping it roughly as she examined the child's hands like she was looking for evidence of some imaginary crime. Katrina winced at the unexpected contact. Confusion and fear began to creep into her young face as this strange woman treated her like a criminal. You see, Patricia Coleman wasn't just having a bad day. This wasn't just about basketball or property lines or garden maintenance. To understand what was really happening here, you need to know exactly who Patricia thought she was and where she believed her authority came from. Patricia Coleman came from what she liked to call old Willowbrook money. Her family had owned the textile mills that built this town back in the 1800s, when men in top hats made fortunes off the sweat and labor of people they considered beneath them. That legacy, that history of looking down on others, it ran through Patricia's veins like poison. She'd grown up believing that her bloodline, her family name, her connection to the town's founding families gave her some kind of royal status. When she married Richard Coleman, a tech entrepreneur who'd made his millions in Silicon Valley before moving back to his hometown, Patricia saw it as the perfect combination. Old money prestige meets new money power. In her twisted mind, this made her the unofficial queen of Willowbrook Heights, the ultimate authority on who belonged and who didn't. For the past 2 years, ever since families like the Washingtons started moving into her precious neighborhood, Patricia had been filing complaint after complaint with the city. She dressed up her racism in fancy language about property values and neighborhood character. But anyone with half a brain could see what she really meant. She'd appointed herself the protector of what she called traditional neighborhood values, which was just her code for keeping the neighborhood as white and exclusive as possible. And now, standing over this 8-year-old black child, Patricia felt like she had the chance to make a statement, to show everyone exactly who was in charge. "Where are your parents?" Patricia demanded, her voice getting louder and more aggressive by the second. "They need to teach you some respect for other people's property." Katrina, still trying to be polite despite the growing fear in her chest, answered as best she could. "They're at work, ma'am. They had an important meeting today." Patricia's laugh was cold and cruel. "Probably at work somewhere they don't belong," she sneered, making assumptions that revealed just how deep her prejudice ran. In her mind, she'd already decided what kind of people Katrina's parents must be, what kind of jobs they must have, what their place in society should be. But Katrina loved her parents fiercely, the way children do when they feel safe and protected and valued. Even at 8 years old, even scared and confused, she tried to defend them. "My mommy and daddy work really hard," she said, her small voice getting stronger. "They help lots of people." Patricia scoffed. "I'm sure they do. Probably service workers or renters who think they can afford to live in a neighborhood like this." Every word dripped with contempt, with the kind of casual racism that Patricia had probably been practicing her whole life. That's when the front door of the house next door opened, and Grandma Rose Washington stepped onto her porch. Rose had heard the commotion from inside, heard Patricia's raised voice and her granddaughter's frightened responses, and she knew she had to intervene. "Patricia, what's going on here?" Rose's voice was calm, but firm. The voice of a woman who'd spent decades managing classrooms full of children and knew how to handle difficult situations. But Patricia was beyond reason now. She turned to face Rose with all the fury she'd been building up over the past 2 years. "Rose, you need to control this child better," she snapped. "She was on my property without permission." Rose looked at her granddaughter, saw the fear in Katrina's eyes, saw how the little girl was holding her arm where Patricia had grabbed her. Her grandmother's instincts kicked in immediately. "She's 8 years old, she was just playing," Rose said, her voice getting a little harder. "There's no need to frighten her like this." But Patricia was just getting started. All the resentment, all the hatred, all the frustration she'd been holding inside came pouring out like water through a broken dam. "This is exactly what I warned the HOA about," she declared, her voice rising so that neighbors up and down the street could hear every word. "First, you people move in, now your grandchildren think they can do whatever they want." There it was again. You people. The phrase that revealed everything Patricia really thought about her black neighbors. The phrase that showed this was never really about property or respect or neighborhood standards. This was about race, pure and simple. Rose tried to keep her voice steady, tried to de-escalate the situation for her granddaughter's sake. Patricia, please, Katrina is a good child. She wasn't causing any trouble. But Patricia was beyond listening now. She was on a roll, drunk on her own perceived power and authority. She pointed her finger at Rose like a weapon. I've been living in this neighborhood my whole life, she declared. My family built this town when yours were probably. She caught herself before she said something even worse, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. That's when little Katrina, overwhelmed by the hatred and anger swirling around her, decided she'd had enough. She started walking back toward her grandmother's house, clutching her basketball against her chest like a shield, just wanting to get away from this scary woman who seemed to hate her for no reason at all. But Patricia couldn't let it go. She couldn't stand the idea that this child was walking away from her, wasn't cowering under her authority the way she expected. "Don't you walk away from me when I'm talking to you," she shouted, her voice cracking with rage. And that's when Patricia Coleman made the decision that would change everything. She lunged forward and grabbed Katrina's shoulder, spinning the little girl around with enough force to make her stumble. Katrina, frightened and confused, did what any child would do when grabbed by a stranger. She pulled away. "Don't touch me," Katrina said, her voice shaking but brave, the way her parents had taught her to speak up for herself when someone made her uncomfortable. Those 3 words sent Patricia into a fury, unlike anything the quiet neighborhood had ever seen. How dare this child speak to her that way? How dare she show defiance instead of submission? In Patricia's twisted worldview, this was the ultimate disrespect, the final proof that these people didn't know their place. The slap came fast and hard, the sound of Patricia's palm meeting Katrina's cheek echoing through the quiet street like a gunshot. "Don't you dare speak to me that way," Patricia screamed, her voice so loud that birds scattered from nearby trees. The sound seemed to freeze time for a moment. Katrina stood there, her small hand reaching up to touch the burning red mark on her face, tears immediately springing to her eyes. The shock of being hit by an adult, by someone who was supposed to be a safe grown-up in her world, hit her harder than the slap itself. "Patricia, how dare you?" Grandma Rose's voice cut through the silence like a sword. The retired teacher was moving faster than she had in years, rushing toward her granddaughter with all the protective fury of a lioness defending her cub. But the damage was done. The sound of that slap had carried, and neighbors were starting to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Henderson from across the street appeared at her front window, her face pale with shock. The Johnsons, returning from their afternoon errands, stopped their car in the middle of the street when they saw the commotion. Tom Bradley, who'd been working in his garage, came walking over with a concerned look on his face. Patricia looked around at the gathering crowd and realized for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she'd gone too far. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing or trying to make things right, she doubled down on her hatred. "Everyone saw it," she announced to the assembled neighbors. "That child was trespassing on my property, and when I tried to correct her behavior, she was disrespectful. Someone needed to teach her some manners." If you think Patricia was wrong for hitting that innocent child, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. If anyone bullies your child like this, what will you do? Let me know your thoughts below. Because while Patricia stood there trying to justify her actions to the neighbors, she had no idea that her victim wasn't just any 8-year-old girl. She had no idea that Grandma Rose was already reaching for her phone, dialing a number that would bring the full weight of justice down on Patricia's head. And she definitely had no idea that the important meeting Katrina's parents were attending was about to end very, very abruptly. The moment that slap echoed through Willowbrook Heights, something shifted in the air. It was like the whole neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But nobody was moving faster than Grandma Rose Washington, who rushed toward her crying granddaughter with the speed and determination of a woman half her age. "Oh, baby girl, oh my sweet baby," Rose whispered as she dropped to her knees beside Katrina, gathering the sobbing child into her arms. The sight of that bright red handprint blazing across her granddaughter's small cheek sent a wave of protective fury through Rose that she hadn't felt since her teaching days when she had to defend her students from bullies. Katrina was crying the kind of deep, heartbroken sobs that only come from pure confusion and hurt. "Grandma, I didn't do anything wrong," she managed to get out between her tears. "I was just getting my ball. Why did she hit me? Why does she hate me?" Those words hit Rose like a punch to the gut. Here was her innocent granddaughter, forced to confront the ugly reality of racism at just 8 years old, having to ask questions that no child should ever have to ask. But Rose was a smart woman, a strategic woman, and she knew that comfort wasn't the only thing Katrina needed right now. She needed justice. With hands that were trembling with both anger and purpose, Rose pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Click, the red handprint on Katrina's cheek. Click, the tear tracks down her granddaughter's face. Click, the way Katrina was holding her arm where Patricia had grabbed her so roughly. Every piece of evidence that would be needed to make sure Patricia Coleman faced consequences for what she'd done. Then Rose scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Diana Washington, Katrina's mother. Her daughter-in-law, who could handle any crisis with the kind of calm, controlled fury that came from years of being a federal prosecutor. The phone rang once, twice. Then Diana's professional voice came on the line. "Hi, Mom. I'm actually in a meeting right now. Can I call you back in about an hour?" "Diana." Rose's voice was steady but filled with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't a social call. "You need to come now. Someone just put their hands on Katrina." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, Rose could practically feel the transformation happening. The professional, composed Mayor Diana Washington was disappearing, replaced by something much more primal and dangerous, a mother whose child had been hurt. What happened? Diana's voice had dropped to that deadly quiet tone that Rose recognized from when her daughter-in-law was about to demolish someone in court. "Patricia Coleman slapped Katrina across the face," Rose said, making sure to speak clearly so there could be no misunderstanding. "Hard enough to leave a handprint. I have pictures." Patricia, who had been standing there trying to justify her actions to the growing crowd of neighbors, caught enough of Rose's phone conversation to know exactly what was happening. But instead of showing any remorse, instead of realizing the magnitude of what she'd done, Patricia just got more defiant. "Go ahead, call whoever you want," she announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "I know people in this city, important people. Nothing's going to happen to me for disciplining a disrespectful child." Patricia had no idea that she just made the biggest miscalculation of her life. She had no idea that the woman Rose was calling didn't just know important people. She was one of the most important people in the entire city. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in the Willowbrook City Council chambers, Diana Washington was sitting at the head of a massive conference table surrounded by department heads, budget analysts, and city officials. They were deep into a discussion about community safety funding when Diana's phone buzzed. She'd almost ignored it. After all, this was one of the most important budget meetings of the year, and the decisions they made today would affect thousands of residents. But something about the timing, something about her instincts as a mother, made her glance at the caller ID. Grandma Rose. Rose never called during work hours unless it was important. "Excuse me for just one moment," Diana said to the room full of officials, stepping outside into the hallway to take the call. The professional composure she'd maintained through years of high-pressure legal cases and political negotiations was about to be tested like never before. When Rose finished explaining what had happened, Diana's entire face transformed. The colleagues who knew her best would later say they'd never seen anything like it. The way her professional mask just melted away, replaced by something fierce and protective and absolutely terrifying. "I'm on my way," Diana said, her voice so cold it could have frozen fire. "Keep Katrina safe. Document everything. And Mom, don't let that woman leave." Diana hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, her hands shaking with the effort of controlling the rage that was building inside her chest. Someone had put their hands on her baby. Someone had slapped her 8-year-old daughter across the face hard enough to leave a mark. The federal prosecutor in her was already building the case, but the mother in her just wanted to get to Katrina as fast as humanly possible. She walked back into the conference room, and every single person at that table could see that something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't the same woman who had walked out 5 minutes earlier. "Family emergency," Diana announced, her voice clipped and professional, but with an edge that made everyone sit up straighter. "I have to leave immediately." Marcus Washington, who had been sitting across the table reviewing police department budget reports, took one look at his wife's face and knew that whatever had happened was serious. Very serious. He'd seen Diana angry before. They'd been married for 10 years, and he'd watched her tear apart defense attorneys who tried to get criminals off on technicalities. But this was different. This was personal. "I'm coming with you," Marcus said, already standing up and reaching for his jacket. "Marcus, you don't have to." Diana started, but her husband cut her off. "Someone hurt our daughter," he said simply. "I'm coming." The drive through Willowbrook City was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Diana's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white as she navigated through traffic with the kind of controlled speed that comes from years of high-pressure situations. In the passenger seat, Marcus was on his phone, calling Rose back to get the full details of what had happened. "She did what?" Marcus's voice got dangerously quiet as Rose explained how Patricia had grabbed Katrina, how she'd slapped her, how she'd used phrases like "you people," and made it clear that this was about race, not property lines or basketballs. Diana glanced over at her husband and saw the look she recognized from his most difficult cases. The expression Marcus got when he was dealing with someone who had crossed a line that should never be crossed. Someone who had hurt the innocent. Someone who was about to face the full consequences of their actions. "That woman has no idea what she's just done," Diana said, her voice steady but filled with a promise that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "She has no idea who she just messed with." Back in Willowbrook Heights, Patricia Coleman was feeling pretty good about herself. She'd made her point, established her authority, and shown everyone in the neighborhood exactly who was in charge. The fact that Rose was on the phone didn't worry her at all. What could some retired teacher's phone calls possibly accomplish? Patricia pulled out her own phone and dialed her husband Richard's private number. He answered on the first ring, probably assuming she was calling about dinner plans or social events. "Richard, I need you to handle something before it gets out of hand," Patricia said, her voice still carrying that self-righteous tone that suggested she believed she was the victim in this situation. "What kind of something?" Richard asked, and Patricia could hear the wariness in his voice. He knew his wife, knew her tendency to create problems and then expect him to solve them with his money and connections. "I had to discipline a neighbor child who was trespassing on our property," Patricia explained, conveniently leaving out the part about slapping an 8-year-old across the face. "Now the grandmother is making threats and trying to cause trouble. I need you to call your people at City Hall and make sure this doesn't turn into anything." Richard sighed on the other end of the line. "Patricia, what exactly did you do?" But Patricia wasn't interested in explaining herself to her husband any more than she'd been interested in listening to Katrina's explanation about the basketball. Just handle it, Richard. That's what I married you for. Your connections. After hanging up with her husband, Patricia turned her attention back to the neighbors who were still standing around, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. She could see the judgment in their eyes, but she interpreted it as support for her actions rather than criticism. I hope you all saw what happened here, she announced to the assembled crowd. Someone needed to teach that child some respect, and clearly her family wasn't going to do it. Tom Bradley, who had been standing there in shocked silence, finally found his voice. Patricia, she's just a kid. 8 years old, you can't just hit someone else's child. But Patricia waved him off dismissively. That's exactly the kind of thinking that's destroying neighborhoods like ours, Tom. When children don't learn boundaries and respect, this is what happens. Mrs. Henderson, who had come out of her house to see what all the commotion was about, shook her head in disbelief. Patricia, I've lived on this street for 30 years and I've never seen anything like this. That little girl wasn't hurting anyone. Oh, Mrs. Henderson, Patricia said with that condescending smile she'd perfected over years of HOA meetings. I know change is hard, but someone has to maintain standards around here. Meanwhile, Grandma Rose was still holding Katrina close, whispering words of comfort while keeping one eye on Patricia to make sure she didn't try to leave. Rose had been teaching children for over 40 years, and she'd dealt with her share of difficult parents and community members, but she'd never encountered anything quite like Patricia Coleman's combination of entitlement and hatred. Is Mommy coming, Grandma? Katrina asked, her voice small and scared. Yes, baby girl, Rose assured her. Mommy and Daddy are both coming, and they're going to make sure this never happens again. Patricia overheard this exchange and actually laughed. Actually laughed at the idea that Katrina's parents could do anything to challenge her authority. Your property value just dropped, Rose, Patricia called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. I hope you realize what kind of family drama you've just invited into this neighborhood. The HOA is going to hear about this, and we don't tolerate people who can't control their family members. But Rose just smiled, a calm, knowing smile that made Patricia's confidence waver just slightly. Oh, Patricia, Rose said quietly, I don't think you understand what's about to happen here. Because while Patricia was busy threatening property values and HOA meetings, while she was assuming that phone calls to parents would result in apologies and submission, she had no idea that two of the most powerful people in the entire city were racing through the streets toward Willowbrook Heights. She had no idea that the family drama she was talking about was about to become her worst nightmare. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and share with others, because what happens when the parents arrive will blow your mind. Because Patricia Coleman was about to discover that all the old money and social connections in the world couldn't protect her from what was coming. The black sedan was getting closer, and everything Patricia thought she knew about power was about to be turned completely upside down. The sound came first, the deep, powerful rumble of an engine that meant business, cutting through the tense atmosphere of Willowbrook Heights like a sword through silk. Every head on Elm Street turned toward the sound, and what they saw rolling up to the curb was a sleek black sedan that seemed to radiate authority from every gleaming surface. The car came to a stop with the kind of precision that suggested the driver was used to making entrances that mattered. For a moment, nobody moved. The neighbors who had gathered to witness Patricia's meltdown stood frozen, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Patricia, who had been running her mouth nonstop since slapping Katrina, found herself staring at that black sedan with a growing sense of unease. Then the driver's door opened, and Diana Washington stepped out. If you've ever seen someone command a room just by walking into it, you'll understand what happened next. Diana emerged from that car like a force of nature, wrapped in a perfectly tailored business suit, Her posture was ramrod straight, her movements deliberate and controlled, and her eyes were locked on Patricia Coleman with the kind of focus that made grown men in courtrooms break down and confess their crimes. Diana was dressed for the important city budget meeting she'd just abandoned, a sharp charcoal gray suit that spoke of power and professionalism, her hair pulled back in a style that said she was serious about everything she did, and shoes that clicked against the pavement with the authority of someone who was used to walking into hostile situations and emerging victorious. But this wasn't just any hostile situation. This was personal. This was about her baby girl. Every step Diana took toward Patricia was calculated, controlled, and absolutely terrifying. The neighbors who had been standing around Patricia, listening to her justify her actions, instinctively stepped aside to create a path. It was like watching the Red Sea part, but instead of Moses, it was a mother whose child had been hurt and who was about to rain down consequences like the wrath of heaven itself. Patricia, who had been feeling so confident just moments before, suddenly found herself face to face with someone whose presence filled the entire street. She tried to maintain her superior attitude, tried to summon up that sense of entitlement that had carried her through this whole ugly confrontation. But something about Diana Washington made her take an involuntary step backward. "Miss Coleman," Diana said, her voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood with crystal clarity, "I understand you laid hands on my daughter." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation that invited debate or explanation. It was a statement of fact, delivered by someone who already knew exactly what had happened and was now here to deal with the consequences. Patricia's first instinct was to go on the defensive, to justify her actions the same way she'd been doing with the neighbors for the past 20 minutes. "Your daughter was trespassing on my property," she shot back, trying to regain some of that righteous indignation that had fueled her rage. "I was well within my rights, too." But Diana cut her off with just 4 words that hit like a physical blow. "She's 8 years old." The way Diana said it, the deadly quiet of her voice, the absolute control she maintained over every syllable, made Patricia's mouth go dry. This wasn't some flustered parent she could intimidate or dismiss. This was someone who radiated the kind of authority that comes from years of facing down criminals and corrupt officials and emerging victorious every single time. Patricia tried to rally, tried to fall back on the assumptions and prejudices that had made her feel so powerful just minutes earlier. "Look," she said, her voice getting shriller as her confidence started to crumble. "I don't know what kind of work you people do, but this is a respectable neighborhood with standards, and—" "What kind of work do you think I do, Miss Coleman?" Diana interrupted, her voice still that same dangerous quiet that made everyone lean in to make sure they didn't miss a single word. Patricia's brain, clouded by years of racist assumptions and social prejudice, went exactly where Diana expected it to go. "Some city job, probably," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Probably an affirmative action hire thinking you can throw your weight around in a neighborhood you don't belong in." The silence that followed those words was so complete, so absolute, that you could have heard a pin drop 3 blocks away. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The neighbors who had been watching this confrontation unfold suddenly realized they were about to witness something historic, something that would be talked about in Willowbrook Heights for decades to come. Diana's smile was cold and sharp and absolutely terrifying. "I'm Mayor Diana Washington," she said, her voice carrying the weight of every courtroom victory, every political battle, every moment she'd fought for justice and won. "This is my city." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching from her front porch, gasped so loudly it echoed off the houses. Tom Bradley, who had been trying to talk sense into Patricia for the past half hour, felt his jaw drop open as the full magnitude of what Patricia had done hit him like a freight train. "Patricia," he said, his voice filled with horrified disbelief, "you just slapped the mayor's daughter." "But it was Mrs. Henderson's reaction that really drove the point home. "Oh my God, Patricia," she called out from across the street, her voice carrying 30 years of neighborhood wisdom and the absolute certainty that Patricia had just destroyed her own life. "What have you done?" Patricia's face went through a series of color changes that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. First, the flush of anger and defiance drained away completely, leaving her pale as fresh snow. Then, as the implications started to sink in, she began to look positively green around the edges. "That's not, you can't be," Patricia stammered, her brain refusing to process what she was hearing. "The mayor is, you're not." But before Diana could respond, before Patricia could finish processing the first bombshell, the sound of another engine filled the air. This time it wasn't the smooth purr of a luxury sedan. This was the deep, aggressive rumble of a police SUV, complete with emergency lights that painted the entire street in flashing red and blue. The second vehicle pulled up behind Diana's car with the kind of precision that spoke of years of emergency response training. When it came to a stop, the emergency lights kept flashing, making it clear to everyone watching that this wasn't a social visit. This was official business. The driver's door opened, and Chief Marcus Washington stepped out. If Diana's arrival had been impressive, Marcus's entrance was absolutely overwhelming. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, wearing his full dress uniform with every piece of brass gleaming in the afternoon sun, Marcus Washington looked like the embodiment of law enforcement authority. His badge caught the light and reflected it back like a beacon. His utility belt carried all the tools of his trade, and his hand rested casually on his radio in a way that suggested he was ready to call for backup if the situation required it. But it was his presence, more than his uniform or his size, that made every single person on that street suddenly remember what it felt like to be pulled over by a cop or called to the principal's office. Marcus radiated the kind of authority that comes from 15 years of dealing with the worst society has to offer, and emerging stronger and more determined every single time. Patricia, who had been struggling to process the revelation that she'd slapped the mayor's daughter, now found herself staring at what was clearly a high-ranking police officer who was walking toward her with the measured pace of someone who was used to making arrests and didn't expect any resistance. Marcus's approach was textbook law enforcement. Controlled, professional, and absolutely intimidating. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated to demonstrate that he was in complete control of the situation. When he reached the group of neighbors and his wife, he positioned himself in a way that gave him clear sight lines to everyone present while keeping Patricia in his direct line of focus. "I'm Chief Marcus Washington," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made hardened criminals think twice about their life choices. "That's my daughter you assaulted." The word assaulted hit Patricia like a physical blow. Up until that moment, she'd been thinking of this as a neighborhood dispute, maybe a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right phone calls or social connections. But assault was a criminal charge. Assault meant lawyers in courtrooms and consequences that all of her husband's money might not be able to make disappear. Patricia began to hyperventilate, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps as the full reality of her situation crashed down on her like a collapsing building. She'd assaulted the police chief's daughter. She'd slapped the mayor's child. Every racist assumption she'd made, every moment of entitled rage, every word of hatred she'd spewed had been directed at the family of two of the most powerful people in the entire city. But Marcus wasn't finished. As if the situation couldn't get any more overwhelming for Patricia, the sound of more vehicles filled the air. 2 additional police SUVs pulled up, their emergency lights joining the light show that was already turning Elm Street into something that looked like a crime scene from a television show. 4 officers in full uniform emerged from those vehicles, each one taking a position that created a professional perimeter around the situation. These weren't officers responding to a domestic dispute or a noise complaint. These were members of the chief's personal detail, responding to a call that someone had assaulted their boss's child. The neighbors who had gathered to watch Patricia's meltdown now found themselves in the middle of what looked like a major police operation. Mrs. Henderson retreated to her porch. Tom Bradley backed up toward his driveway, and even Grandma Rose, who was still holding Katrina close, felt the gravity of the moment settle over the street like a heavy blanket. Patricia looked around at the officers, at the flashing lights, at the faces of neighbors who were now staring at her with a mixture of shock, horror, and what might have been pity. She tried to speak, tried to find some way to explain or justify or minimize what she'd done, but no words came out. Her mouth moved, but only small, choking sounds emerged. "Officers," Marcus said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who was used to giving orders that were followed without question. "I need you to witness and document everything that happens here. We're dealing with an assault on a minor, and I want everything done by the book." The phrase "by the book" sent another wave of panic through Patricia's already overwhelmed system. By the book meant no special treatment, no consideration for her social status or her husband's connections. By the book meant she was going to be treated exactly like any other person who had committed a crime against a child. Diana stepped closer to her husband, and for a moment the two of them stood together like an immovable force of justice and parental protection. Here were two people who had dedicated their careers to serving and protecting their community, and someone had attacked their child. Someone had put hands on their baby and thought there would be no consequences. "Patricia Coleman," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you need to understand the gravity of what you've done here today." Because Patricia Coleman's day was about to get so much worse, and she still had no idea just how deep the hole she dug for herself really was. The moment had arrived. Chief Marcus Washington looked around at his officers, at the assembled neighbors, at his wife Diana standing beside him with the kind of controlled fury that could level buildings, and then his eyes settled on Patricia Coleman, who was still hyperventilating as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Marcus raised his hand in a subtle signal that every officer on the scene immediately recognized. It was time for official business, time for consequences, time for justice. "Miss Coleman," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in law enforcement and the righteous anger of a father whose child had been hurt, "you're under arrest for assault on a minor." Those words hit the quiet neighborhood like a thunderclap. Even though everyone had been expecting something like this, hearing it spoken with official authority by the chief of police himself made it real in a way that sent shockwaves through every person standing on that street. Patricia's reaction was immediate and desperate. "This is ridiculous," she screamed, her voice cracking with panic and disbelief. "I barely touched her. You can't arrest me for disciplining a disrespectful child." But Diana Washington stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried all the weight of her years as a federal prosecutor, all the authority of her position as mayor, and all the cold fury of a mother who had seen the evidence of what had been done to her child. "The evidence says otherwise, Miss Coleman," Diana said, holding up her phone to show the photos that Grandma Rose had taken. Clear, undeniable images of the bright red handprint on Katrina's cheek, the tear tracks down her face, the marks on her arm where Patricia had grabbed her. "These photographs will be admitted as evidence in your trial." The sound of handcuffs clicking into place seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. Officer Martinez, one of Marcus's most experienced detectives, had approached Patricia with professional efficiency, and now Patricia Coleman found her hands cuffed behind her back while her neighbors watched in stunned silence. Patricia looked around at the faces surrounding her, neighbors she'd tried to impress, people she'd thought would support her actions, members of the community she'd believed shared her prejudices. But what she saw in their eyes wasn't support or understanding. It was shock, disgust, and something that might have been pity for how completely she'd destroyed her own life. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived on this street for 30 years, and had seen Patricia grow from an entitled teenager into an entitled adult, shook her head slowly. "Patricia," she said, her voice filled with sadness and disappointment, "what have you become?" That's when Patricia realized the full scope of what she'd lost. Her social standing, her reputation, her position as the queen bee of Willowbrook Heights, it was all crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. The neighbors who had once deferred to her HOA authority now looked at her like she was a stranger, someone they'd never really known at all. But Patricia's nightmare was far from over. As Officer Martinez was reading her Miranda rights, another car pulled up to the curb, a sleek silver BMW that Patricia recognized immediately. Richard Coleman, her husband, the man whose tech fortune had bought their house and funded their lifestyle, stepped out of that car looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Richard had been in his downtown office when he'd gotten the call from his assistant. "Sir, there are reports on social media that your wife has been arrested for assaulting a child. The police are at your house." Richard had dropped everything and raced home, praying that it was some kind of misunderstanding, some social media rumor that had gotten out of hand. But one look at the scene in front of him, the police cars, the officers, his wife in handcuffs surrounded by neighbors, told him that this was no rumor. This was real, and it was a disaster of epic proportions. "Patricia, what the hell have you done?" Richard demanded, his voice filled with the kind of horror that comes from watching your entire life explode in real time. Patricia turned to her husband with desperate eyes, seeing him as her last hope for rescue from the consequences of her actions. "Richard, thank God you're here," she gasped. "Call your lawyers. Call your connections at City Hall. These people are trying to railroad me for nothing." But Richard was looking around at the scene, taking in the police officers, the official vehicles, and most importantly, the two people standing at the center of it all, with the kind of authority that money couldn't buy and connections couldn't influence. "Patricia," he said quietly, "that's the mayor and the police chief." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow, driving home once again the magnitude of her miscalculation. But instead of accepting responsibility, instead of showing remorse for what she'd done to an innocent child, Patricia fell back on the desperate plea that revealed just how little she understood about justice and consequence. "I didn't know who you were," she cried out, looking at Diana and Marcus with pleading eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. If I had known, I never would have." But Diana Washington cut her off with words that would become legendary in Willowbrook Heights, words that showed exactly what kind of leader the city had elected and what kind of mother was raising the next generation. "It shouldn't matter who we are, Miss Coleman," Diana said, her voice carrying across the street with crystal clarity. "No child deserves to be treated the way you treated my daughter, regardless of who their parents are. The fact that you think it matters shows exactly why you're standing there in handcuffs." Those words hit every person on that street like a revelation. This wasn't about power protecting power. This wasn't about important people using their influence to get special treatment. This was about right and wrong, about protecting children, about the fundamental principle that no adult has the right to put their hands on someone else's child in anger, no matter what their excuse might be. As Patricia was led to the police car, the legal consequences of her actions were already beginning to unfold like dominoes falling in a perfectly orchestrated sequence. The assault on a minor charge was just the beginning. The FBI's Civil Rights Division would soon open an investigation into whether Patricia's actions constituted a hate crime, given the clear racial motivation behind her attack. The Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting that very evening, and Patricia Coleman was voted out of her leadership position by a unanimous vote. The same neighbors who had once deferred to her authority now wanted nothing to do with her or her toxic influence on their community. But the consequences extended far beyond Patricia herself. Richard's tech company, Coleman Digital Solutions, faced immediate backlash as news of the incident spread through social media and local news outlets. Clients began canceling contracts, employees started updating their resumes, and business partners quietly distanced themselves from the Coleman name. The company that Richard had spent 15 years building began crumbling overnight. Meanwhile, something beautiful was beginning to happen in the neighborhood itself. The shock of what they'd witnessed, the realization that they'd stood by while hatred flourished in their community, sparked a transformation that nobody could have predicted. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach Grandma Rose as the police cars finally drove away, Patricia in the back of one of them. "Rose," she said, her voice heavy with regret, "I owe you and your family an apology. We should have spoken up years ago when Patricia started making those comments. We should have stood up to her hatred instead of letting it grow." Tom Bradley nodded, stepping forward with his own apology. "She's right, Rose. We all heard the things Patricia said, the complaints she filed, the way she talked about your family and others. We were cowards, and that little girl paid the price for our silence." But Rose, being the gracious woman she was, the teacher who had spent her career believing in people's capacity for growth and change, simply nodded. "The important thing is that we're all here now," she said. "The important thing is that we learn from this and make sure it never happens again." That conversation led to a community meeting the following week, where neighbors who had never really talked to each other before sat down and had honest conversations about inclusion, about standing up to hatred, about creating the kind of neighborhood where all children could feel safe and valued. 6 months later, the Washington family was sitting around Grandma Rose's dinner table, sharing a meal and reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible afternoon. Katrina, resilient in the way that children can be when they're surrounded by love and support, had not only recovered from her trauma, but had become something of a neighborhood celebrity, befriending kids of all backgrounds and becoming the unofficial ambassador of inclusion for the street. The story of Patricia Coleman's fall from grace became legendary throughout the city. A cautionary tale that parents told their children about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating everyone with respect. It was a reminder that actions have consequences, that power can be taken away as quickly as it's given, and that true authority comes not from money or social status, but from character and integrity. But more than that, it became a story of hope. Hope that communities can heal from division, hope that people can choose to be better than their worst impulses, and hope that sometimes, just sometimes, justice really does prevail. The Washington family had turned their worst day into a catalyst for transformation that would benefit their community for generations to come. And that, more than any legal victory or political achievement, was the true measure of their success. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.